Something unusual has been happening around Shedeur Sanders, and the more people look into it, the stranger the situation begins to feel. For months, a loud group of sports media voices kept repeating the same storyline about the young quarterback. According to them, Sanders wasn't ready. They questioned his leadership, his focus, even his commitment to football. Week after week, new rumors appeared, new takes surfaced, and the same criticism kept circulating across sports radio and online debates. At first, many fans simply accepted it. That's how the sports media cycle often works. When a narrative is repeated often enough, it eventually starts sounding like fact. But then something unexpected happened. Fans began looking closer at the claims themselves. They started comparing what commentators were saying with actual interviews, game film, and statements from players inside the locker room. And that's when the story started changing. Because the more people investigated the narrative surrounding Sanders, the more they noticed a gap between what was being reported and what was actually happening. And once fans began asking questions, the conversation around him started shifting in a big way. Long before fans began questioning anything, the narrative surrounding Shedeur Sanders had already taken root across sports media. It didn't happen all at once. Instead, it slowly built up through repeated discussions, debates, and commentary that all seemed to circle around the same central idea. Sanders wasn't ready to lead. Commentators across radio shows, podcasts, and television panels began raising doubts about nearly every aspect of his game. Some questioned whether he could truly read NFL defenses. Others suggested his confidence might actually be arrogance. There were even conversations implying that his growing personal brand might be distracting him from focusing on football. The names shaping much of that conversation weren't random voices either. Journalists like Jason Lloyd and radio personalities such as Adam the Bull frequently appeared in discussions where Sanders' readiness became a central topic. Their commentary often sparked long debates among fans, especially as different shows repeated similar concerns. And this is where sports media narratives tend to gain momentum. When multiple analysts echo the same criticisms across different platforms, the message begins to feel consistent. That consistency can create the impression that there must be truth behind the claims. Over time, the repetition alone can turn speculation into something that sounds almost factual. Soon, the discussion around Sanders started following a predictable pattern. Each week seemed to introduce another question about his leadership, another rumor about locker room dynamics, or another theory about whether he could truly handle the pressure of being a franchise quarterback. At first, most fans simply absorbed the conversation without pushing back. After all, sports analysts and journalists are expected to have insider knowledge. Many people assume the commentary must be coming from reliable sources inside the organization. But something about the narrative didn't quite sit right with everyone. Because while the media conversation grew louder, another set of voices seemed to be saying something very different. Players who actually practiced alongside Sanders every day were speaking positively about him. Some analysts studying his film were pointing out strengths that weren't being mentioned in those debates. That contrast began raising questions. If the narrative about Sanders was accurate, why were the people closest to the situation telling a different story? And once fans started noticing that gap between media commentary and locker room support, the entire conversation around Sanders began moving in a completely new direction. The turning point didn't come from another analyst or breaking news report. It came from the fans themselves. As the conversation around Shedeur Sanders kept circulating through sports media, listeners started paying closer attention to the details being discussed on radio shows and debate panels. And slowly, something interesting began happening. Instead of simply accepting every criticism being repeated on air, fans started calling into sports radio programs and asking direct questions. What made these moments stand out was how simple the questions actually were. They weren't complicated breakdowns of football strategy. They were basic challenges to the narrative that had been repeated for months. One of the most common questions sounded something like this: if Sanders is really such a problem inside the team, then why do the players around him seem to say the exact opposite? That question alone created an uncomfortable pause in several conversations. Because when callers began bringing up statements from players and comparing them with media commentary, the contrast became difficult to ignore. Fans pointed out that people discussing Sanders on television or radio were often relying on unnamed sources or vague reports, while the players themselves were speaking publicly with their names attached. That difference mattered. Suddenly, the debate wasn't just about Sanders' performance on the field anymore. It became a discussion about credibility. Fans wanted to know why anonymous rumors were sometimes treated like reliable information, while direct comments from teammates seemed to receive less attention. Those call-in moments began changing the tone of the conversation almost immediately. Hosts who were used to controlling the direction of the discussion now had to respond to real-time pushback from listeners who had been watching the games, reading interviews, and comparing statements themselves. Instead of a one-sided conversation about Sanders' supposed flaws, the debate started becoming more balanced. Some callers even began bringing specific examples to support their arguments. They mentioned interviews where teammates praised Sanders' confidence and preparation. They referenced film breakdowns from analysts who saw strong decision-making in his play. Each example chipped away at the certainty of the earlier narrative. And as those discussions continued, something else started happening. The audience listening to those debates began realizing that the story surrounding Sanders might not be as clear-cut as it once seemed. If fans could easily point out contradictions between media commentary and player statements, then maybe the entire narrative deserved a closer look. But once those questions started circulating publicly, the conversation reached an even more surprising point. Because the voices inside the locker room were about to enter the debate, and their perspective would shift the entire story. As the debate around Shedeur Sanders grew louder across sports media, another perspective quietly started gaining attention, the voices coming directly from inside the locker room. And what those voices were saying didn't seem to match the narrative that had been circulating for months. The most noticeable difference came from respected veterans on the Cleveland Browns roster. These weren't fringe players or anonymous sources. These were leaders on the team whose opinions carry real weight inside the organization. One of the most prominent names mentioned was Myles Garrett. As one of the most respected players in the league, Garrett's words tend to resonate far beyond the locker room. When he spoke about Sanders, his comments highlighted the young quarterback's confidence and the presence he brings to the team environment. Garrett described Sanders as someone who carries himself with poise and energy, traits that often matter just as much as raw talent in professional football. For a veteran leader to publicly acknowledge those qualities suggested that Sanders had already earned a level of respect among his teammates. Then there was Denzel Ward, another influential figure on the roster. Ward also spoke positively about Sanders' approach to the game, noting the competitive mindset and enthusiasm he brings to practices and team meetings. These weren't vague endorsements either. Both players interact with Sanders daily, during practice, in meetings, and throughout the preparation that happens behind the scenes every week. Their perspective comes from direct observation rather than speculation. And that distinction became important as the debate continued. Because when players who share the field with Sanders describe him in positive terms, it creates a very different picture from the one some commentators were presenting. It suggests that the internal perception of the quarterback may be far more supportive than the external narrative implied. Fans quickly picked up on that contrast. If respected veterans were speaking confidently about Sanders' leadership and work ethic, then the claims that he lacked those qualities started sounding less convincing. The more those locker room voices were heard, the more the earlier narrative began to lose its certainty. But the conversation didn't stop with player endorsements. Soon, analysts who study quarterback play began examining Sanders' performance on film, and their conclusions would introduce an entirely new layer to the discussion. While the debate between fans and media personalities continued, another group quietly entered the conversation: film analysts. These are people who don't rely on locker room rumors or anonymous sources. Instead, they study the actual game footage, every snap, every read, every decision made on the field. And when analysts started reviewing the tape of Shedeur Sanders, the conversation took another interesting turn. One of the names that kept appearing in those discussions was Chase Daniel, who has built a reputation for detailed quarterback film breakdowns online. Daniel spent years in the NFL studying defenses and offensive systems, so when he analyzes quarterback play, many fans pay attention. During one of his breakdowns, Daniel highlighted moments where Sanders successfully diagnosed defensive coverages before the snap. He pointed out plays where Sanders adjusted protection calls, recognized blitz pressure, and quickly moved through his progressions to find the correct receiver. Those are not simple tasks for any quarterback, especially a young one. Reading defenses in the NFL requires recognizing subtle differences in alignment, anticipating how defenders will rotate after the snap, and reacting in a fraction of a second. It's the type of skill that separates experienced quarterbacks from inexperienced ones. And yet, several of the plays Daniel highlighted showed Sanders doing exactly that. That directly challenged one of the biggest criticisms circulating in sports media: the claim that Sanders couldn't read defenses effectively. If the film showed examples of him making correct reads and adjustments, then the criticism suddenly looked far less certain. Other quarterback coaches and analysts online began posting similar film clips as well. They broke down Sanders' footwork, his timing, and the way he manipulated defenders with his eyes before delivering passes. Each breakdown added another piece to the puzzle. What made these analyses different from typical debate segments was that the evidence was visible. Fans could watch the clips themselves and see the decisions Sanders was making in real time. That transparency changed the tone of the conversation. Instead of arguing over opinions, viewers could now examine actual plays and judge the quarterback's performance for themselves. And as more of those film breakdowns circulated online, the earlier narrative about Sanders began facing even more scrutiny. But just as the debate was starting to settle around film analysis, another moment surfaced that pushed the conversation in an entirely different direction. Because the next criticism aimed at Sanders didn't just raise questions about his performance, it raised questions about how the narrative itself was being formed. Just when the conversation around Shedeur Sanders was starting to shift toward film analysis and locker room support, another moment appeared that pushed the debate in a completely different direction. This time, the discussion came from comments made by Rex Ryan, a longtime football personality known for his outspoken opinions. Ryan had publicly suggested that Sanders needed to show more engagement during team meetings. Specifically, he claimed the young quarterback should sit closer to the front of the room, implying that doing so would demonstrate stronger leadership and focus. At first, the criticism spread quickly. Comments like that tend to gain traction because they sound like insider observations. When a former coach makes a statement about player behavior, many fans assume the claim must be based on credible information. But in this case, something unexpected happened. Shortly after Ryan's remarks began circulating online, video clips from team meetings started appearing across social media. And those clips showed something very different from the criticism that had been repeated on television. In the footage, Sanders was already sitting in the front row during meetings. The reaction online was immediate. Fans who had been following the debate quickly noticed the contradiction. If Sanders was already sitting in the front during team meetings, then the original criticism suddenly didn't make sense. People began asking a simple but important question. How did that claim even become part of the narrative in the first place? That moment became a turning point in the discussion. Because it wasn't just about whether Sanders sat in the front row or not. It was about the broader pattern fans were starting to notice. When a criticism gains attention, and then evidence appears showing the opposite, it naturally raises questions about how the original story formed. And once those questions started spreading, they didn't stop there. Fans began revisiting other claims that had been made about Sanders throughout the season. Some of those stories started looking less certain once people examined them more closely. The situation slowly evolved from a debate about one quarterback into something larger, a discussion about how sports narratives are created and repeated. None of this meant that Sanders was beyond criticism. Every quarterback in the NFL faces scrutiny at some point. But the Rex Ryan moment showed something important. Sometimes a storyline can gain momentum before anyone stops to verify whether it's actually accurate. And once fans began noticing that pattern, the conversation around Sanders entered an entirely new phase. Because the next part of the debate wasn't just about one comment or one analyst, it was about the double standard people were beginning to see across the entire discussion. After the moment involving Rex Ryan sparked new questions, fans started examining the broader conversation around Shedeur Sanders more closely. And what many people began noticing was a pattern that felt difficult to ignore. It looked like the standards for evaluating Sanders kept changing. When criticism surfaced, especially if it came from unnamed sources or speculation, it often spread quickly through headlines and debates. But when positive evaluations appeared, the reaction sometimes felt completely different. One example that caught attention involved Kurt Warner, a former NFL MVP and one of the most respected quarterback analysts in football. Warner has spent years studying quarterback play, both as a player and through detailed film breakdowns. When he analyzed Sanders' game, his comments were largely positive. Warner pointed out Sanders' confidence in the pocket, his ability to process defensive coverage, and the mechanics he displayed while delivering throws under pressure. Coming from a Hall of Fame quarterback who built a career reading defenses and managing offenses, that kind of analysis usually carries significant weight. But in this situation, the response from some critics was unexpected. Instead of focusing on the substance of Warner's evaluation, some commentators dismissed it by pointing out that he wasn't physically inside the Cleveland Browns locker room every day. According to that argument, Warner's perspective lacked the insider knowledge necessary to fully understand the situation. That reasoning immediately raised questions among fans. Because earlier criticisms of Sanders had often been based on anonymous reports or second-hand rumors, sources that also weren't inside the locker room publicly speaking with their names attached. Yet those criticisms were frequently treated as reliable information. The contrast was obvious. Positive analysis from a Hall of Fame quarterback was being questioned because he was in the building, while negative speculation from unnamed sources was often accepted without the same scrutiny. That inconsistency became one of the biggest talking points in the debate. Fans began asking why the rules seemed to change depending on the direction of the opinion. If outside perspectives weren't valid when they were positive, then shouldn't the same standard apply to negative commentary as well? Once people started noticing that double standard, the conversation shifted again. The debate was no longer just about Sanders, performance, or leadership. It had turned into a discussion about how narratives around athletes can evolve and sometimes become reinforced, even when conflicting evidence begins appearing. And at that point, the story surrounding Sanders started becoming something much larger than one quarterback's development. It was turning into a broader conversation about how sports narratives themselves are created. Once fans began noticing the contradictions surrounding Shedeur Sanders, the discussion slowly evolved into something much bigger than one player or one season. What started as a debate about Sanders' readiness began turning into a larger conversation about how narratives are created in sports media. Because the deeper people looked, the more they realized something interesting. In modern sports coverage, storylines often move incredibly fast. A single comment on a radio show can spark a debate. That debate can turn into social media discussions, highlight clips, and opinion segments within hours. By the time fans hear the same idea repeated across multiple platforms, it can start feeling like established truth, even if the original claim was only speculation. Sanders entered the league already surrounded by attention. His confidence, his style, and even his family background naturally placed him in the spotlight. And when a young quarterback carries that much attention, every detail of his performance becomes magnified. Every throw gets analyzed. Every interview becomes a headline. Every rumor suddenly becomes a topic for debate. That environment makes it easy for narratives to form quickly, especially when the player involved attracts strong opinions from both supporters and critics. Some commentators continued questioning whether Sanders was truly prepared for the responsibilities of leading a franchise. At the same time, fans, analysts, and even teammates were presenting examples that painted a completely different picture. The gap between those perspectives became impossible to ignore. On one side were media voices repeating concerns about leadership and readiness. On the other side were film analysts pointing to positive plays, respected veterans supporting Sanders publicly, and fans comparing claims with real evidence. When those two sides of the conversation collided, something interesting happened. The audience stopped treating the discussion as a one-way narrative. Instead of simply accepting what they heard on radio shows or television panels, more fans began examining the details themselves. They watched film breakdowns, listened to player interviews, and compared different viewpoints before forming their own conclusions. That shift changed the entire dynamic of the debate. Because once fans start analyzing the evidence themselves, the narrative is no longer controlled by just a handful of commentators. It becomes a shared conversation where multiple perspectives compete for attention. And right now, that's exactly what's happening around Sanders. The discussion isn't one-sided anymore. The spotlight is growing brighter, and every performance, every interview, and every new piece of information will shape how the story continues to evolve. Which means the next chapter of this debate may be the most revealing one yet. Something unusual happens when a sports narrative starts clashing with visible reality. It begins to lose control. And that's exactly what started unfolding around Shedeur Sanders. For months, the storyline surrounding Sanders followed a familiar pattern. Certain commentators questioned whether he was ready to lead. They raised concerns about leadership, focus, and maturity. Those discussions dominated radio shows, podcasts, and television panels. But once fans began comparing those claims with actual evidence, the conversation started shifting in a noticeable way. People weren't just listening anymore. They were watching. Fans began examining practice footage, interviews, and film breakdowns. They looked at statements from players inside the Cleveland Browns locker room and compared them with what commentators were saying on air. And as those comparisons continued, a pattern started becoming clearer. The story being told in media discussions didn't always match what people could see with their own eyes. When respected veterans like Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward spoke positively about Sanders, fans noticed. When analysts such as Kurt Warner broke down film and highlighted his decision-making, fans noticed that too. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't moving in just one direction anymore. Each new example created more curiosity. Why were the voices closest to the situation describing Sanders differently than the critics discussing him from a distance? Why did some evaluations rely on unnamed sources, while others came directly from players and analysts willing to attach their names? Those questions kept building momentum. At the same time, the broader sports conversation around quarterbacks continued evolving. Analysts debated potential alternatives, threw around hypothetical names, and speculated about what the team might do next. But each new theory only added to the noise surrounding Sanders. And the more noise there was, the more attention the situation received. Because when a narrative becomes controversial, people pay closer attention to every detail. Every throw, every interview, and every performance becomes part of the larger story. Right now, that spotlight is growing brighter with every week. Supporters believe Sanders is proving critics wrong. Skeptics still believe the questions about his development remain valid. Both sides are watching closely, waiting for the next piece of evidence that supports their view. And that's why the story around Sanders is far from finished. In fact, it might just be entering its most important chapter yet, because what happens on the field next could finally settle the debate. At this point, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders has clearly become bigger than just one player trying to prove himself. What started as a steady stream of criticism slowly turned into a debate about something much deeper: how narratives in sports are formed, repeated, and sometimes challenged by the very people watching the game. As fans began comparing media commentary with locker room voices, film breakdowns, and real on-field evidence, the discussion stopped being controlled by a few loud opinions. Support from respected teammates like Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward, along with analysis from experienced voices such as Kurt Warner, helped shift the tone of the entire conversation. But ultimately, debates and narratives only last so long. In the NFL, the final answer always comes from the field. Every game, every drive, and every decision Sanders makes will continue shaping how the league views him. And as the spotlight grows brighter, one thing is certain: the story surrounding Sanders is far from finished.